Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, perhaps. I guess I'm the last man standing here between you and the drinks in 40 minutes. But I'll do my best to keep your attention here. So my name is Fredrik Backner. I'm the Chief Analytics Officer with Kix, which is a company probably best known among the women here in the audience. We have 2.5 million members in our club across the Nordics. We are the #1 beauty provider in the Nordics, selling all the premium brands throughout 240 shops, and of course in our e-com site. Kix is a part of the Axel Jonsson family, where you have other well-known brands like Åhléns, Dustin, Martin Severa, Axe Food, where you have Hemköp and other grocery outlets. Together with the beauty part of Åhléns, we are having a turnover of 5 billion SEK at Kix. I will talk today not as much about my experience at Kix, because I only started 2 weeks ago as Chief Analytics Officer. On the other hand, I've been running the Telia Company's global data analytics function for the last 5 years, where I built up that function and organization from scratch to today's more than 50 people. So many of today's lessons learned are from the last 5 years there. And I also did this presentation partly to myself, since switching jobs, I obviously was very concerned about avoiding some of the pitfalls that we did in the early days of big data and machine learning 5 years ago. It was a very immature industry as opposed to today. So I hope to be able to get your attention on guiding you through some of my perspectives on the do's and don'ts of setting up a machine learning analytics practice. It's easy for me now also to make a bit of a comparison. In the last many years I've been working in telco. How is that different to the retail area? Or is it? It's actually 99% similar, I would say. There are, of course, some use cases specific and unique to telco, like network optimization, predictive maintenance, and some that are maybe more unique to the retail side, such as category management, purchase planning, supply chain and logistics that we don't have much of, at least in the telco space. But the vast majority of the use cases are very similar, not the least around customer analytics, which is the bread and butter for any efficient industry, like customer lifecycle value, customer value management, NBA, and so on and so forth, and the list goes on. But what is even more common across any industry, I would say, are the different capabilities that you need to build up when you set out to build up an analytics organization. And of course, it starts with one part of that is technology and platforms that you need to have a solid grip on, and I'll come back to that later on as well. You need to have a very solid data acquisition strategy and operations, and making sure that the quality of the data is high enough for you to do proper and efficient analytics. And then, of course, you need to retain and get the talents in terms of data science, pipelining, to be able to do the efficient analytics. One area that I see often being overlooked, and I know I did that initially when I set out this 4 or 5 years ago, was to set up the Data Translator role, or the Value Realization Office, being the glue between business and the more technology side of analytics, qualifying and quantifying the use cases, and making sure you do the betting on the right horses and that you're barking up the right trees. And that is very tightly connected to the business and adoption that I think I heard in many sessions today is the #1 challenge of being successful, to make business side actually change or adopt. And as the saying goes, a successful analytics implementation is roughly 10% about the data, 20% about the algos, and 70% change management. So without the change management, you will not be successful in analytics. Not going to go through this slide in any detail, but it is important to understand where you are when you set out your journey. You might already you might start from scratch, maybe focusing more on the left side, starting to just do basic plain vanilla BI and reporting, or you might be already on your way to the right side. But it is important to understand where do you want to bet here and now. And on the left-hand side, it's pretty decent value, but it's on the other hand, easier to execute and realize than maybe on the right-hand side when you want to go into deep learning and narrow AI and those type of use cases requiring significantly much more data, high-quality data, entirely different algos and competences. Taking a quick look at the data analytics ecosystem, there are many forms of this, but this is my view on it, and with a bit of a technology touch to it. Any successful analytics implementation, I would say, require these steps. And it starts, of course, with the data acquisition. How do you get data from the various source systems into a data management system, whether it's a data lake or whether it's a data warehouse, and ultimately perhaps into other type of storages. Then, once you have that, you need to have solid data engineers that make sure that the data preparation and the refinement is there for in the form of analytics base tables or in data cubes, so that the analytics can actually take place with the data science and the data analyst doing their job. And again, the final step, not seldomly overlooked, is the operationalization of analytics. If you remember the previous slide, the use cases and the types of analytics to the left, BI and reporting, are typically consumed by humans, which is a bit easier to actually get involved and into the business. The right-hand side, the machine learning, the advanced analytics, the deep learning, often has other systems as the consumer of the analytics, and that's why those often takes a bit longer time and harder, because then you have to change other business processes in order to be able to reap the benefits of that analytics. So this is basically just a repeat of the previous slide, but again, it's important to understand where do you start and which tiers, which parts of that analytics stack do you want to focus on, or do you have to focus on? Some successful companies, particularly the unicorns or the startups, can leapfrog to number 3 and number 4, but if you have a legacy and if you have don't have the competences, you should start with getting the data in place and make sure that you have the pull from the organization. And that I also will come back to the big bets versus the quick wins. So that brings us a little bit into some of my top advice. I collected 5 thoughts or 5 lessons learned and pitfalls and considerations that I think are fundamental to address in order to be successful. And the number 1, and this is in no real order of appearance, so to say, but one of the most important is if you don't have any good reason, and very seldom you have, you should go cloud. Today, compared to only a couple of years ago, the public cloud providers, the Amazon, the Azure, and then the Google Cloud, they are far more mature now than they were only a few years ago. When I started out the journey 5 years ago, you couldn't even go cloud, realistically speaking. So that's why we had, in my previous job, we were all on-prem, or still on-prem, and that is hugely costly. It takes a lot of time, things break, and you have to maintain it and operate yourself. With the cloud, you can forget about operations and maintenance for the PaaS and the SaaS services. Then, of course, you still have to make sure that you operate and maintain the analytics apps and the data pipelines that you build on that cloud. No one will take care of that for you. So you still have to have DevOps and IT ops or operations and maintenance for those types of apps that you build. Final note on cloud, avoiding bill shock. In order to be keeping that as cost efficient as possible, you need to make sure that you have a grip on the compute and this data transfer and the data storage that you use. Otherwise, you will get a nice shock at the end of the month when you get the invoice. But that's also something to consider. So once you have decided and maybe have a starting grip on the technology, you clearly need to make sure you have the talent. And in my mind, the number 1 resource, and actually I'm there right now, because at Kix we have a pretty small analytics team. In Axel Jonsson we have a bit bigger, but what I'm starting to recruit now is the data engineer. Of course, together very closely with the data scientist. But without the data engineer and having data readily available in an analyzable form, which is largely one of the tasks for the data engineer, the data scientist will not be able to do his or her job, or at least not stay very long if you recruit one. The third role that I think is vital to recruit is the data translator, sitting in a value realization office, making sure that you bark up the right horses, that you balance between the quick wins and the right bets, and qualifying and quantifying the value of the different use cases. And that is a role that I have seen being forgotten and overlooked quite often. DevOps is something you will not get away with, even if you go cloud. And I think it's important to live by the term, if you build it, you deploy it. For those of you that have been working in software engineering, the typical paradigm in traditional is you have someone developing something, you have the configuration manager making the build, and then you put it into production. And there's no end-to-end responsibility of that. With DevOps, it's really, when you build the data pipeline or the models, you're also responsible for making sure that they work in production. An increasingly coming role is the machine learning engineer, particularly if you are in the deep learning spectrum of things, which is really entirely changing the way how data scientists work, where you're not as much train a model, but you rather prepare the data. You do a level of feature engineering, but much of that is being done by that architecture, the neural network architecture that you choose. So keep an eye on the machine learning engineer. It's a very interesting happening now in the market, I would say. Having been in the machine learning industry for more than 5 years, I have definitely, in part, fallen victim of death by being overwhelmed by technology. It's a crazy space out there, and you need to have a real solid due diligence on which technology are you betting on, what is it that you really need, and how can you be flexible to. One thing you know for sure, next year there are other technologies that you want to bet on, so you cannot do too much lock-in if you want to be able to have that flexibility. But keeping that in mind, much can be done with what you probably already have. Plain vanilla data warehousing and BI takes you a long way. So be selective when you opt for doing something really advanced. If your organization is not ready for it, you are probably wiser off to wait a little bit longer until you get to that point. A very interesting phenomenon right now, over the last year, is the low code. In software engineering, low code engineering has been a term for a long time, but what we see now in the data science space is a low code data science. And you have good examples that I've seen also represented out here: Data Robot, Data IQ, Machine Learning Studio from Azure, and many others that are providing, that are not, you can basically be a data analyst without a math or stat background. You can still develop very solid models without having to have the PhD in statistics or whatnot. Of course, it's not as efficient if you have a really solid data scientist sitting in their notebook in Jupyter, programming in Python or in R, but it brings you a long way, particularly if you have a scarcity in data scientist competence. And this is just one example, a mapping I did for myself based on the 3 main cloud providers. What are, in each step, what are the different capabilities that Azure, Google, and Amazon are providing. And then on the right-hand side, you see more the third-party independent products. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it just gives you an idea of what are the typical, in each tier of these things, what are the options that you have. And of course, in one way, when you have opted for a particular cloud provider, your choices are, in a good way, limited, unless you opt for adding on a virtual machine a third-party analytics tool. So going on, what I see is, and in my own experience, and also some of the pitfalls we've done in my previous work lives and previous jobs, is the lack of solid cross-functional cooperation. And we have good examples. I think the tribes and the chapters and the guild nomenclature is invented in some sort by Spotify and also Amazon. That's something, particularly having people sitting, a data scientist, a data engineer, a data translator, and the business owner, being the product owner of the backlog, sitting in one continuous team, working over time in highly prioritized business processes of your company. That's so much more effective, because then you get a pull and a commitment and an accountability by the business to actually receive it and put it into production. That is something we did at my my previous job in the last 3 years, and we have seen very good results out of that. So that is a very strong advice that I have. And it's so easy to get caught up in all the grand opportunities that are so promising in terms of monetary value, and forgetting about the quick wins and keeping business happy. So as a leader for analytics, it's important to keep in mind that the quick wins and the quick deliveries providing value to the business is something you need to continuously do. It also gives you time and the tolerance from the business of continuing developing the big bets, and it also provides you probably more likely a better funding for the next period in your budgetary planning. So balancing between quick wins, identifying what are low complexity but quite okay value that you know that you have a high success rate of actually delivering and getting implemented, while betting on the big use cases that will ultimately change the way that your business is executing in parts of the business processes. So having said that, your job as an analyst leader is to choose wisely among not only the use cases, but also among the stakeholders. Which are the stakeholders that you know are having an analytics and data-driven or data-drivenness, and go for the use cases coupled with that. So don't underestimate the change management, the people management, and the stakeholder management. And those are actually my final words with 2 minutes and 36 seconds left. And now drinks time soon, I guess.